So the Ravens are good at drafting most of the time, but they definitely do have their misses in the draft with some bad draft classes, but not too bad because at least with one player every draft class, you can say that they turned out to do something even if underwhelming. But there's one Ravens draft class that stands out amongst the rest for being so bad that nothing really came of the players in this draft outside of maybe one mediocre career, and that was kind of it. And I'm talking about the Ravens 2004 draft. Now, this draft was interesting because the Ravens didn't have a first round pick going into this year because they had traded their first round pick for this draft in the previous year's draft, so they can trade back up to draft Kyle Bowler 19th overall. So the Ravens weren't picking until the 51st pick in the draft. And I will say their first pick was a decent pick, nothing bad, but also nothing where you're like, oh, the Ravens did a good job here. I mean, they got Dewan Edwards out of Oregon State, so it was kind of a decent, get. He was more of a rotational backup player, but had a solid 12-year NFL career, so can't be too down on that pick. But one of the things the Ravens needed heading into this draft was wide receiver. They were desperate for it. I mean, yeah, they had Travis Taylor, but he wasn't necessarily a number one guy, and they were starting to realize that. And after the Terrell Owens trade fell through, the Ravens should have been more desperate than they were. But instead, they ended up picking the complete wrong guys. And now, I'm going to tell you the receivers in this draft that they did pick because they drafted 3 and had 1 undrafted free agent, so 4 total. And then I'm basically going to tell you who they could have taken, as there are some pretty decent names that were picked after the Ravens drafted these wide receivers. But with the Ravens' 3rd round pick and their second of this draft, 82nd overall, they decided to take Washington State's DeVard Darling. And Darling only stuck around till 2008. He had a couple years in 07 and 08 where he had to pick up the slack a little more when it pertained to catching the ball, but only 37 catches and 4 touchdowns in his whole entire career is not necessarily what you wanted. And I know people say, well, he's a 3rd round pick, but let's look at this, right? So the Ravens picked Dewan Edwards in the 2nd round, 51st overall, but they could have picked a pretty solid receiver in Bernard Berrien, who the Bears would pick 4 picks before the Ravens took DeVard Darling. So even though he wasn't there and the Ravens ended up choosing Darling, they could have picked him in the 2nd round, 51st overall before Chicago did, because Berrien turned out to be a pretty solid receiver. But the Ravens didn't have a 4th round draft pick, but hey, again, there was 2 other receivers in the 4th round that they could have had the opportunity to get had they had a 4th round pick, or had they just pulled the trigger on them earlier. With the 108th pick, the New York Jets selected Jericho Cotchery, who obviously we know underrated career, very good player, not Hall of Fame or anything, but on the Ravens, he could have been a true number 1 wide receiver and given the young Kyle Bowler that target that the Ravens were so often looking for early in his career. And then 12 picks after Jericho Cotchery, the Jaguars drafted Ernest Wilford, which, ironically enough, this was a pick the Jaguars got from the Ravens. And again, Ernest Wilford wasn't anything to necessarily scoff over, but he had a pretty solid career in itself and was better than what the Ravens were throwing out there. As right after those 2 were picked, the Ravens then decided, after picking linebacker Roderick Green in the 5th round, who had 12 career sacks, but that was about it, and then picking Bowling Green quarterback Josh Harris for whatever reason. He never took an NFL snap. The Ravens then in the 6th round and their first pick of the 7th round decided to go wide receiver again, as with the 199th pick, the Ravens took Northern Arizona wide receiver Clarence Moore, and they mainly did this because of his size. They thought he was going to be a big jump ball receiver. In 2004, he would show flashes. I mean, 24 catches, 293 yards, and 4 touchdowns isn't necessarily big numbers, but, it was showing that if the Ravens use him more, this might work out. But the thing was, the next 2 years, they used him less and less. Granted, they did get Derek Mason in free agency the next year and drafted Mark Clayton in 05, so he was kind of pushed down on the depth chart. But I feel like Clarence Moore was showing you that potential, and then they just completely let it go to waste. He finished his career with 29 catches, 353 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And then the last receiver the Ravens drafted with the 244th pick was Kentucky wide receiver Derek Abney, who did not even play in an NFL game in the regular season. And during this time, in between those two picks, a wide receiver by the name of Patrick Creighton was drafted in the 7th round, 216th overall. And again, not necessarily a sexy pick, but definitely better options than what the Ravens had on the board. The Ravens would then draft guard Brian Rimpf, who would start a couple of games here and there, but only lasted 2 seasons in the NFL. And then, even with the undrafted rookie free agents, the Ravens went out and got B.J. Sams, another wide receiver, making it 4 total receivers the Ravens picked in this draft. And combine those 4 receivers in their careers. This is combine their career numbers, not in one season. They had 67 catches, 933 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, and 1 rushing touchdown. So even combine those 4 receiver stats, technically 3, because Derek Abney was the only one of these guys that didn't record a single stat line in the NFL at all. They posted under 1,000 yards. They barely had 10 total touchdowns. And for the most part, their biggest get of this draft was B.J. Sams, who wasn't even drafted, and it wasn't because of his receiving skills. He had 2 career receiving yards on 1 catch, 19 career rushing yards on 4 carries with the 1 touchdown that I mentioned. But as a returner, he's one of the best in Ravens history, so I can't fully call this a bust, but I mean, his return numbers, he returned 128 kickoffs for 1,378 yards and 2 TDs, and then had 147 punt returns for 3,341 yards. That means on his 275 total returns, he had over 5,000 return yards and 2 TDs to show for it. So that in itself was good, but again, it was another wide receiver that failed for the Ravens. And of course, in 2004, as I mentioned before, the Ravens had one of the worst wide receiver cores I've ever seen, as no one posted more than 35 catches, and only 1 player had over 400 yards receiving, and that was Travis Taylor, who was injured half of the season. So the Ravens just didn't really do their job. And as for these other picks, they never really amounted to anything. Like I said, their best pick in this draft was Dwan Edwards, and then even DeVar Darling and Clarence Moore were okay at certain points in their career, but were never anything great. And I will say too, the Ravens had a chance to make some steals with undrafted rookie free agent wide receivers, because even though they picked B.J. Sams, there was 2 wide receivers by the name of Malcolm Floyd and Wes Welker that went undrafted to the Chargers. Obviously, Welker wouldn't stay on the Chargers. He would actually get his start with the Dolphins before ultimately going to the Patriots, and that's where his career started. And Malcolm Floyd, he would stay on the Chargers, and he would become a big part of that receiving core for Phillip Rivers and company in the future. So the Ravens, again, even when they had a chance to get undrafted free agent guys and pick whoever they wanted, they missed out on the opportunity to do so, with those 2 guys in particular being the 2 notable ones that went undrafted that year. So as much as we love Ozzie Newsome and his, trade history with the Hall of Famers, and even now with Eric DeCosta being able to pick out the talent, there are some times where they're going to miss, and sometimes it might even be a whole entire draft. And when you look at it, 2004 might be the worst, and that's saying a lot considering in 1999 the Ravens only had 4 picks, but they picked Chris McAllister in round 1, they picked Brandon Stokely with their 2nd pick in round 4, and even though he never turned out to be, that great with the Ravens, he still put out a solid career. And they drafted Edwin Mulatalo in the 4th round, who was a very, very solid lineman for the Ravens offensively throughout his almost 10-year career. So the Ravens still made something out of the little that they had in that draft, whereas this one, 2004, I just look back at it and go, what were the Ravens thinking? Like, what was their game plan with this draft? Because obviously it didn't really work out all that well. But that's just my thoughts. You can tell me in the comments below, do you think there's a Ravens draft that is worse than this? I would really like to see if you could find another one, because just looking at it, I really can't say there is. I mean, like I said, with all these other drafts, there's at least 1 or 2 other players that tend to do something, even if the rest of the draft isn't great. But at 04, there really just wasn't anything to get excited about with the draft picks that we had. And although some of them, like Clarence Moore, DeVar Darling, and even B.J. Sams with his return skills showed flashes, and Dwan Edwards was a decent rotational player, the Ravens didn't necessarily get what they wanted in return. So to me, this is probably the only F draft the Ravens have ever come out with, and I don't even think it's close, but you might think differently. So let me know in the comments below if you think there's a worse draft for the Ravens than this one. But until then, stay safe out there, and I will catch you all in the next one.